we'll get to you in a moment. There's been a lot of talk about African American applicants to Harvard in sort of a general, indistinguishable way, when in fact they cover a very broad swath of applicants.
Of course.
What do you do with respect to an African American applicant? I mean, you're concerned about diversity of viewpoint. Let's say his viewpoints tend to be very close to, the white applicants. He grew up in Grosse Pointe, had a great upbringing, comfortable. His parents went to Harvard. He's a legacy. And yet, under your system, when he checks African American, he gets a tip. He gets a benefit from that. Isn't that very stereotypical under the Harvard program?
I think well, first of all, it is simply not the case that every black applicant gets a, quote, tip. In fact, I'll direct the court's attention to page 1,811 of the joint appendix, which includes this beautiful chart, which represents an undisputed model of the relative importance of race on application outcomes. And the one that you cannot actually even see to your far right is race. Race explains.
I can't see it because it's far away.
Nonetheless, you have the page reference.
It is not zero.
It is very close to zero. That is, the testimony in the case was.
Well, so there's only a little racial discrimination in the case.
No. Are you asking me whether Harvard is, you're asking me to answer a question that assumes that Harvard is discriminating on the basis of race? No, I can't accept that.
Well,
what Harvard says
isn't that what is, Mr. Waxman, isn't that what the case is about, the discrimination against Asian Americans?
There was count one of the complaint was that Harvard was intentionally discriminating against Asian Americans. The entire evidence of that case, all of the plaintiff's proof, was that Asian Americans are treated worse than white applicants. That is, that there was prejudice, intentional discrimination. The evidence could not more soundly have refuted that. What do you do with the charts?
What do you do with the charts in their brief? I think they're on page 24 or 43, the academic decile and the comparative treatment of African Americans, Hispanics, and Asian Americans. You don't see a surprising disparity in that?
So there's a lot to be said about that, but I guess the first thing I would say about that chart is that their own expert agreed that because that chart is simply a descriptive statistic, it is, quote, not equal to evidence of discrimination. It reflects a pattern which might or might not be real. Now, understand that that chart that they've displayed for you, they have eliminated all ALDC applicants. So 1/3 of the admitted class over 6 years, they're not even in that chart. That chart is predicated on something called an academic index. An academic index is a formula that looks at two things: high school grades and test scores.
And so people in the different racial categories, they have a different result based on other factors, which include race.
They have a different result because among the many, many, many characteristics of any particular individual applicant that Harvard considers, one that it does not consider is the academic index. That is the very metric that they're displaying for you. Harvard doesn't even use the testimony in the case was the only reason that the academic index is even calculated is because the Ivy League athletic rules require that your recruited athlete class, the AI for your recruited athlete class, not be more than 2 standard deviations below the matriculating class last year.
Put aside the hypothetical about the African American applicant who's a legacy. Take 2 African American applicants in the same category, however you want to take it. They both get, or both can get, a tip, right, based on their race. And yet they may have entirely different views. Some of their views may contribute to diversity from the perspective of Asians or whites. Some of them may not. And yet it's true that they're eligible for the same increase in their opportunities for admission based solely on their skin color.
So the point—
That was a question.
No, I know. I'm attempting to answer your question. There is no doubt that as the testimony showed, that for applicants who are essentially so strong on multiple dimensions, so extraordinarily strong on multiple dimensions, that they are sort of on the bubble, that they're a real candidate for admission, being African American, or being Hispanic, or in some instances being Asian American, can provide one of many, many tips that will put you in.
People say that, yes, but you will have to concede if it provides one of many, that in some cases it will be determinative.
I do concede that.
Okay, so we're talking about race as a determining factor in admission to Harvard.
Race for some highly qualified applicants can be the determinant factor, just as being an oboe player in a year in which the Harvard-Radcliffe Orchestra needs an oboe player will be the tip.
We did not fight a civil war about oboe players.
We
did fight a civil war to eliminate racial discrimination, and that's why it's a matter of considerable concern. And I think it's important for you to establish whether or not granting a credit based solely on skin color is based on a stereotype when you say this brings diversity of viewpoint. It may not bring diversity of viewpoint in a particular case at all.
Well, number one, viewpoint diversity, while Harvard values it and seeks it, is not the only by far the only reason for wanting a genuinely diverse class. We want a diverse class for backgrounds and interests and lots of things other than just viewpoint. If we were to use, for example, the example that has been discussed, I believe, for every other advocate that has stood up this morning, and ask, what about taking race into account if the student writes about it? The fact of the matter is Harvard is attempting not to have among a class that is diverse among many generations, a class that is racially diverse only for people for whom their racial identity and their racial experiences is of such compelling importance that they write about it. Right? Your hypothetical about the black student who may have very different views than the stereotype of what a black student will have is in fact the subject of that's discussed in the Corona report. The Corona report gave, in its analysis of the importance and dimensions of diversity, an actual example that came from Richard Light's book, published book, which had a particular class. It happened to have 3 African-American students in it. An African-American student gave an answer in a discussion, which another African-American student said, "That is not my view. My view is quite the opposite." And a third one said, "I wasn't actually going to say anything, but I have a completely different view." That was an incredible learning experience, not only for the non-African Americans in the discussion, but for them. And that's what Harvard is trying to get at. I'm sorry for taking so long.
No, I appreciate your answers.